So yesterday was a pretty bad day for Republicans, to say the least. The current frontrunner of the Republican Party, Donald Trump, was indicted for the second time on multiple charges related to the mishandling of federal documents. And now you have the Supreme Court striking down Alabama's congressional map, claiming that it disenfranchises black voters. And this, of course, is going to have wide-reaching implications across the entire South, which really could, right on its own, hand Democrats the majority in 2024, which means Republicans really need to start getting serious about winning elections and coming up with new strategies to win over voters, because they're already going to be at likely a deficit now going into 2024, losing a couple of districts potentially in the Deep South related to this case. So we're going to talk about the implications of the Voting Rights Act and ultimately how this benefits Democrats going into 2024. But of course, before we do, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing down below and liking this video if you enjoy. So the Supreme Court struck down Alabama's congressional map. They argued that it doesn't proportionally represent black voters. There's only one majority black district. Black population's about 27%. So of course, this case argues that there should be at least two districts in Alabama that are majority black. Of course, this brings into question what those two districts would actually look like, because you can look at some of the former plans for the Alabama redistricting, and these districts are quite very much gerrymandered to give Democrats the advantage. But of course, the VRA allows this to happen. And, you know, you look at some of these plaintiff maps that were proposed earlier, you have a lot of these maps stretching all across the state. And yeah, you could argue that this map on its own is certainly gerrymandered, but it's a bit more compact than some of these other proposals that have been put forth. But of course, the Supreme Court has mandated that Alabama must add a second district that is majority black. And the reason why this has wide-reaching implications is because it's likely not just going to impact Alabama, but other states in the South as well. I think Mississippi will probably be fine, considering the fact that this is really the only way you can draw a majority black district without ridiculously gerrymandering the state. But you could argue Alabama, that's probably what's going to happen as well. But in states like Louisiana, you're certainly probably going to see another black district. If this case isn't argued under a different pretense, because obviously the pretense that the Alabama Attorney General argued under didn't work. And of course, you had conservative justices like Roberts and Kavanaugh siding with the liberal majority in this case, throwing out these maps. And of course, Republicans are obviously very angry about that, because these districts are really the only reason why Republicans have the majority anyway. I mean, you take a look back at the 2022 elections, the Republicans only control the House by 4 seats. I mean, there's 218 seats required for a majority. Republicans have 222. They can't afford to lose any more districts. And 2024 House elections are a whole topic for a different video, because that in its own, I think, is an uphill battle for Republicans, just the way the maps are drawn already. I mean, you take a look at Illinois, New Jersey, even California. There's a number of states where Republicans should theoretically, New Mexico, there's a number of states where Republicans should be getting more seats that they're not. And, you know, obviously Republicans are weaponizing gerrymandering as well. You see that in Texas. You see that in places like Georgia, Florida, South Carolina. But there's a number of states that are going to be impacted by this decision. As we already mentioned earlier, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, South Carolina. North Carolina's map is probably fine because this was a court-drawn map, although Republicans are going to probably put forward a new redistricted map. But the thing is, litigation for that could take a couple of years, which means it could be used for 2024, but then in future elections, there'll be a new map used for those. But needless to say, Republicans need to gain other House districts if they want to maintain control of the House in 2024. And 2022 was a year where they were winning the generic ballot by 3 points. So if Republicans are barely mustering the House with a 3-point lead in the popular vote, how are they going to do in a presidential year, which, if anything, is probably going to favor the Democrats in terms of the overall popular vote? So really, really tough road ahead for Republicans in terms of keeping the House majority. I mean, we could just take a look at some of these other maps at the moment. South Carolina, I think this map certainly is probably going to be struck down if the Alabama map can't be upheld under different pretenses. Of course, there are other parts of the VRA that the Attorney General of Alabama could have argued under. And, you know, I think the part about districts being compact, I haven't really looked too much into the legalese of the case itself since, you know, obviously the story just broke. But, you know, taking a look at South Carolina, you certainly could draw another majority or plurality black district. This one is probably the most generous to Democrats because it gives them a district that's only Again, I don't really like 538 because R plus 13 is very misleading. I don't actually know how this district voted in terms of the presidential election, but you're going to have a Dem leading district, of course, in South Carolina 1. South Carolina 6 is going to stay majority Black, majority Democrat. And then, of course, I guess South Carolina's 5th would also be somewhat competitive, even if Republicans have a bit of an advantage. But, you know, even looking at some of these other proposals, I mean, there's other ways to draw South Carolina. I think the old map itself, I guess, was more fair, objectively speaking, considering the fact that you have South Carolina 1, which is pretty compact for the Charleston area. You've got, obviously, the surrounding area, which is majority Black. That's going to Jim Clyburn, the Democrat. And then you have the other parts of the state that are pretty solidly Republican. So, again, in order to accommodate some of these VRA districts, you're going to have to do some pretty aggressive Democratic gerrymandering. But of course, that's something the VRA allows and mandates by law. So unless that changes, you're going to see a pretty gerrymandered South in the other direction. And that's partly because of the fact that the geography in some of these states doesn't line up for another majority Democratic district. I mean, Alabama, again, to sort of draw another Democratic district, you've got to stretch down all the way to Mobile, Alabama, all the way down here from sort of the Black Belt area, which sort of divides up the 1st District of Alabama in half, which, you know, doesn't really conform to the guidelines of being a compact district. But nonetheless, this is a court order. They can't really argue too much with it unless they argue the case under different pretenses and get the map reinstated. But again, South Carolina is going to be impacted by this. Georgia could potentially be impacted by this, although the Georgia districts are fairly compact. So I'm not quite sure, actually. These districts do seem pretty fair, relatively. I mean, they are compact. You're packing, which is a form of gerrymandering. You're packing the Democratic districts together. But suburban Atlanta is now extremely Democratic. And, you know, this is an area in which that actually does favor Republicans because they can just draw extremely partisan Democratic districts that are incredibly compact because really all of Metro Atlanta is sort of heading in that direction. But you've got Atlanta. Texas, I think, is a huge one. Texas was always a bit of a dummy mander, in my opinion, because a lot of these districts, first of all, the Republicans didn't give themselves that much of a majority. I mean, in fact, they gave up seats under the old map that they actually held under Republican control, or seats that they could have flipped. I mean, they could have flipped all of the Rio Grande Valley seats if they wanted to under the old map. But they really decided against that because you've got a lot of ex-urban districts that were sort of trending in Democrats' direction. So basically, this was an incumbent protection map that the Republicans drafted in Texas. And, you know, you're looking at a situation where now this potentially could be made into a map that's more favorable to Democrats because of the VRA. Although the VRA is oftentimes used in the context of Black voters, but it could be used in the context of other minority voters as well. It really depends on how SCOTUS wants to interpret that. But, you know, the Supreme Court has shown, the conservative justices have shown that they are willing to side with the liberal majority on these cases. In the past, that wasn't necessarily the case. When the VRA came up during the Obama years, for instance, Republicans always sort of voted lockstep against striking down a lot of these Republican maps. And now you're in a situation where you've got Kavanaugh and Roberts that are much more willing to listen to Democratic arguments in favor of their maps via the Voting Rights Act. So definitely a tough road ahead for Republicans when it comes to the 2024 House races because they already have to deal with a map that they're sort of at a disadvantage with already. Again, 2022 should have been the year where a lot of these seats that were lean D or lean R should have gone in their direction. They should have been able to hold that. So in 2024, if they lost 10 or 12 seats, it wouldn't have been that big of a decline. But now you're looking at a situation where a Democratic House is almost looking very likely at this point in 2024. I mean, there's really no other way to chalk it up because you're looking at a year where Democrats are probably going to win the popular vote in the House. You're also looking at a year where Democrats are favored in the presidential election in general, which is going to have positive coattails for Democrats. And also the Democrats are 5 seats away from the majority. So they only need to pick up 5 seats, and these VRA seats might be enough. I mean, when you consider Texas, let's say, you know, there's 1 or 2 districts in Texas. Louisiana, there's certainly 1. Alabama, there's another that's already 4 districts. South Carolina, that's 5. That's the majority right there, effectively, or at least a tie in the House of Representatives. So Democrats don't really need a whole lot going for them. Now, depending on how the VRA is interpreted, potentially you could see New Mexico's House map struck down, since all of these districts are majority or plurality Hispanic, even though Hispanics only make up 47% of New Mexico's population. These maps certainly aren't the most compact, as you have New Mexico's second really reaching up all the way to Albuquerque. But of course, given the way this case went, I really doubt that Republicans are going to have an effective argument in this case, because this is institutionally a law that does benefit Democrats in that aspect. And that's just the blunt reality of it. Republicans are going to have to deal with that by sort of winning districts in more northern states that they can actually win, because the South isn't really competitive overall. You have majority black districts that are heavily Democrat, majority white districts that are majority Republican. There's really no swing seats in the South. I mean, maybe there's some in suburban Texas, maybe suburban Atlanta in the next 10 years. But overall, the South is not competitive for the House. So really all the movement's going to be out west, California, New York, and of course the Rust Belt. You know, those are the competitive areas where Republicans can gain ground. But given how the midterms went and given how 2024 is shaping up, it doesn't really seem all that likely that Republicans are going to be able to hold the House at this rate. Again, a lot can change, but given the way things are shaping up, the really vitriolic Republican primary, the fact that Democrats are probably likely to win the presidency anyway, and then of course this VRA decision, is really a near death blow to a Republican majority in the House in 2024, which very well means that Democrats could have a trifecta in January of 2025. So anyway, that's it for today's video. Please leave a thumbs up if you enjoyed, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell notification so you don't miss any more videos that come out. As always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.